I'm Rick Brody. I am a rabbi. I am in Denver, Colorado. I've lived here for 5.5 years. I'm originally from Long Island.
Mm.
I spent my whole childhood there, was educated in the fancy schmancy Northeast, went in New England.
Oh,
Uh,
you were in the fancy ones, huh? Like
yeah,
got one of those
yeah,
fancy degrees.
yeah.
Yeah.
Uh, for my undergraduate, and then I attended the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College in the Philadelphia area. Reconstructionist Judaism is one of the lesser known movements of
Yeah.
American Jewry. Easiest way to describe it simply is that it kind of lands somewhere between reform and conservative. It takes a pretty liberal approach ideologically,
Mm.
with a strong affinity for traditions from the perspective of culture and anthropology and sociology, the idea
Yeah.
that we as a Jewish people are connected through shared practices and a shared identity. And we can get more into talking about some of the values that
Yeah, I'd love
um,
to.
that
So,
played there. Yeah,
well, I want to talk about your. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
oh, yeah, it's just then I've lived in a bunch of different places. I like the claim that I've lived in all four major U.S. time zones:
Okay, that's good. All right, I like it.
Eastern, Central, Mountain, and Pacific. Lived in L.A., lived in Austin, Texas. In fact, when I was living in Austin for 5 years, one of those years, PETA had Paul McCartney announce the annual Vegan City of the Year, and it was
Yeah,
Austin.
it was
Uh,
Austin.
so,
Yeah, I mean,
um,
if you're in Texas, you want to be in Austin. I mean,
exactly. Yeah.
that's, I've been around Texas, and I would say Austin is the one that's probably, well, certainly the most vegan friendly,
Yep.
and definitely I don't know, I think just friendlier overall, to be honest.
Yeah.
But you're in Denver now. I was just in
Yep.
Denver a few months ago now, a couple months ago, and I was surprised that there's so much there. Since the last time I had been there, there was so many more vegan options, vegan restaurants,
Yeah.
vegan people. It was the Mile High City's come a long way in the five
Yeah.
years you've been there, I'm guessing.
Yeah. I mean, COVID definitely hurt some of
Mm,
the vegan restaurants. They just were never able to get back on track. So there were some that closed, but then there have been some others that have opened up in the last couple of years. And then it's pretty rare to find a restaurant that's just considered decent or above in terms of its quality.
yeah.
That's an omnivore restaurant that doesn't have some vegan options.
That's true too, right? I'm kind of a stickler, man. I try to only go to vegan restaurants. That's like something. That's one of my things.
It's an interesting debate. Like there's a big Facebook group for vegan Colorado, and
Mhm.
there's always that back and forth. People promoting, the Omni restaurants that have the vegan options. We need to patronize those because they need to know that there's a demand for it, and then they'll add more, and then there'll be more exposure. And then there's also like we want to support the people who are going that extra mile,
Right. Yeah.
providing.
Exactly. I
Yeah,
I, I I feel like
and we just feel better when it's like we know that there
right.
isn't anything else
No
that
stress.
is there.
I have
Exactly.
a stress-free experience when I go to a vegan restaurant, and
Totally.
that's what hospitality is supposed to give you is
Yeah.
not worrying. That's what you're supposed to do. I don't worry about the dishes. I don't worry about serving. I don't worry about all that stuff. It's to me, it's not something that I'm like don't nobody should go to anything but a vegan restaurant. But for me, I just
You're not a real vegan if you don't
yeah,
go.
yeah, yeah. I'm not really that hardcore. I'm usually not even telling people like you're not a real vegan for feeding your cat. But I certainly think that that's not a vegan thing to do. You know what I mean? I'll say like, oh, that's not a vegan. That's not a very vegan thing to do. Are you sure you're vegan?
Mm,
Who am I to tell who's who? But I can ask what's what. You went vegan at some point along that this whirlwind around the world, and
Mhm.
through your rabbinical kind of learnings, I'm guessing you weren't raised vegan, and so how did you come upon that?
All right. Yeah. So I grew up in a household that ate everything. So even uh, you know, some Jews grow up in an observant Jewish home to one degree or another, which most people know there are strong dietary restrictions within traditional Jewish practice. Um, my family had none of those. I loved bacon.
Really?
I did. I
That's
did.
something rare. That's
And
something rare. Usually, you don't hear Jews say that. That's something that you don't hear every day.
oh, there's a fair number who will say that.
Sure, yeah. I mean, I grew up in LA, and I was fortunate enough to have a lot of Jewish friends growing up, and I lived next door to Israeli immigrants, and
Mhm.
they were much more serious than uh, my American born Jewish friends. You know what I mean?
Mhm. Right, right. So, ate everything.
Mm.
And I remember some point in elementary school, my sister, who was just a year older than I, had a moment of something about not wanting to eat meat. She felt bad for the animals, and I parroted something. Well, but it's just the way it is, and we have to get our food and our protein, our nutrients, because that was the dogma that I was fed.
Mm-hmm.
Just typical standard American diet
Things that
consciousness.
might seem axiomatic but aren't.
Right,
Yes.
right. And then I would meet a few people occasionally who told me they were vegetarian. And as I sort of moved into adolescence, I felt the dawning uh, of a moral consciousness in general,
Hmm.
and conscience. Um, and and then I was. What's fascinating is that I got involved in the beginning of high school with Jewish youth activities, and I was at an event, and a guy who was a senior, whom I really admired, wound up really becoming a mentor of mine, and also wound up becoming a rabbi. He mentioned he was vegetarian, and then I happened to see on his guitar case was a bumper sticker that years later I saw again and realized that it was from the Humane Society of the United States, HSUS, and it was a slogan that they had used for a while. It said, "Animals, it's their world too,"
Mm.
and it just stopped me.
Wow.
This guy just told me he's vegetarian, and this was 1987. I had never heard the word vegan before. The idea, I watched the archive of your conversation with George Martin, and you
Mm.
guys were talking about people in the mid 20th century who might have
Right. The
believed in
40s.
just
Hmm.
the idea, right? And that, how radical that the vegan society, that early on, most people, it was like it was radical enough to say you were vegetarian. When I
Yeah.
decided to become vegetarian, even that, I would say I don't eat meat. Um, like
Yeah.
vegetarian, it just sounded like I was, outing myself as some sort of weirdo.
Yeah.
And and vegan, no one would even know what that meant. But I saw that bumper sticker, and I I had come across some information over the last, the previous year or so about how vegetarians can live completely healthily, uh,
Hmm.
with plenty of protein, uh, not needing meat, and and so that was already kind of there in my mind of like,
Yeah.
is this necessary then? And then I saw that bumper sticker, and then it all just came together. Um,
Bumper stickers work. You know what I mean? I mean, that's why we
Ew.
need slogans.
Totally.
That's why we need to have these calls to action right there on a bumper sticker.
Right.
They
Yeah.
work.
So then I dove in. I sort of across ninth grade from fall of 87 to summer of 88, I sort of phased out different meats.
And did your parents, who were bacon eating Jewish folk, how they react to this change?
Well, my mother, God bless her, had that Jewish mother. My son he's a growing boy.
Yeah.
She was so worried, and she went and got books from the library, and she got a subscription for us to the Vegetarian Times.
Oh, well,
And
I mean, at least she answered it with some intellectual curiosity. I mean, that's fantastic. Yeah,
yeah. At first, they thought it was a phase. They,
sure.
didn't pay attention to what I had said, but I was persistent and insistent that no, this I've drawn a line. This is a moral imperative, and I am not going to participate in the benefiting from the exploitation and
Torture, killing of animals. I was the same way. I was 15 and I went vegetarian, a similar path. And it was mostly about like, I don't want to benefit from death. And that was just like, I knew that.
right.
And again, I didn't know difference between vegetarian and veganism. Really. I didn't really, until Moby started making records, I didn't know what a vegan really was, and some of these movie stars, RZA, some of these musical stars that I liked, started talking about this thing called veganism. It took
Yeah.
a while for me to get there. So, so you said it's a moral imperative, and of course I agree, but it's also something that speaks to your faith. It might seem to the outside observer. How does it speak to your faith, and how are those intertwined?
Wonderful question. So that fall of ninth grade, I mentioned I was getting involved in Jewish activities. This mentor had this commitment of his own, and I was always very drawn to Jewish activities. Our household had a very strong Jewish identity. We would go to services. We had Friday night dinners. We would do all the holidays. We talked about Jewish things. And
I was always jealous of the Friday night dinners from my Israeli friends. Man, they would invite me, and I'd eat the matzah balls, and I would, and they'd turn off the all candle lit dinner with your family, and they would sing
yeah,
songs. It was great, and they would invite me, a goyim, and I loved it. I loved the community of that. The Friday night dinners was something
yeah,
that.
yeah, yeah. So then I had like a crisis because this religious and cultural tradition that I felt so connected to, why didn't it take the same moral stand that I was taking now? And reading up on the history of vegetarianism and the cultural manifestations of it, learned about the Eastern traditions, India, Hinduism, and
Yeah.
Buddhism, and they're having embraced vegetarianism millennia ago.
Yes, exactly, and for millennia as well, right? I
Yeah,
mean,
right.
yeah.
And so I felt betrayed by my own tradition. They've got this, they've got these kosher laws, but like that's insufficient. That's not enough. And then I came across some material from Jewish vegetarians who explained the threads of compassion and justice and concern for animals and a deep ambivalence about the exploitation of animals and the consumption of them, the killing of them for food throughout the tradition, and the idea that the kosher laws represented a kind of compromise between and even going further back in the presentation of the biblical narrative, that the eating of animals itself is understood by many very prominent commentators of Torah from throughout the centuries, understood to be a compromise. That if
What is
we
that compromise? Because like I want to just to pause for a second because Kosher.
Yeah.
I think we all use that word like we know what it means. And what was the so kosher law? We all just kind of know as a set of rules,
Right.
but that's kind of a Saxon way of looking at it, right? We look at the letter of the law instead of the spirit of the law.
Mhm.
What would be but really, I mean, when we talk about scripture, we should be looking more at the spirit of rules and laws
Absolutely.
and,
Right.
and metaphor and parable and these things that seem these things seem wasted on most people. But I'd like to maybe get your comment on what is the spirit of kosher law and why would it seem to be a compromise when it comes to animals?
Yeah. So I'll just kind of walk us through the timeline that the Torah presents. And I'll interject to explain that I mentioned Reconstructionist Judaism. It's in the
Hmm.
liberal realm of the approach to Judaism. We take a very progressive view towards ideologically in terms of understanding that all of our sacred texts are the product of human beings
Right.
who were striving to have a religious experience, who were feeling a connection to the divine as they understood it, and
Hmm.
were sharing texts and ideas and values uh, to manifest their understanding of holiness, and that idea evolves. And we
Hmm.
even see that in the texts themselves. So we have the very beginning of creation. Uh,
Let's start from the beginning.
from the beginning, right? It's like an
And
airplane
this
where
guy begat that guy, and that one begat that one. Yeah, I've read it. All right, so
so we've got this paradise, this garden.
right.
First of all, it's a garden,
Hmm.
right? It's a vegetarian paradise, a vegan paradise. Um,
Yes.
the very first chapter, um, God creates human beings and then says to all of the created sentient life that exists, I give to you all of the seed bearing herbs and fruit bearing trees.
Hmm.
They shall be your food. That's their food. They're vegan. The
Hmm.
Garden of Eden is vegan.
Yes.
Um, it's not an accident. And it's one verse separated from the Torah saying that God creates humanity with the divine imprint, that there's something within us that connects us to the divine. I like to think that part of that is our moral reasoning, our um, consciousness and conscience, and our ability to refine our choices and to try to live in a godly way with compassion and with justice.
Mhm.
The way it's presented from the beginning is like literally a no-brainer. Like there's no other thought about it. Is just this is how you're going to eat.
Yeah.
We then have the expulsion from the Garden of Eden. Um, and there's still no discussion about any change in diet. And
Nothing until the flood,
and
right? There's really nothing until the.
exactly
Mm.
right. And we learned that the whole world had become corrupt with violence. It's not explained exactly what that entailed, but it was bad enough that God decides to destroy everything and start over with Noah and his family. They come out of the ark, and um,
Yeah, they come out of the ark, and he says, "Well, it's funny because you say the ark is something that this antediluvian world of the Bible is vegan, and that's a
right,
long time. Like we're
yeah,
talking, yeah, we're talking
right,
of we're talking a civilization has taken hold. The fall has happened, but even after the fall, when Eve eats the apple, we haven't turned to murdering animals until after the flood, and yeah,
right. And so the understanding from the Jewish perspective, the commentaries on the Torah in this section is that people were mistreating each other and
Mm.
being absolutely horrible towards each other. And after the flood, God says, I'm not going to destroy the world again because it's clear to me that human beings from their youth are prone to corruption and morally problematic behavior. It's sort of just like saying, this is just the nature of humanity. They have the capacity to be good. They have the capacity to make good choices, but they need some direction. They,
They need
it's
religion. They need, yeah. They're born of original sin. They need, yeah.
well, now we don't have that,
Oh.
but there is the idea that we don't consider anything that happened in the garden as like a stain on us,
Mm.
but in a general sense, there's just the idea that what happened in the garden was someone, two children
Yeah.
were told, don't touch that. So
Yes.
what did they do? They touched it, they ate it.
Right.
It's all just a commentary on human nature.
Mm.
That was the only rule they were given, and they broke it.
Right.
But they were told, eat these vegetables, eat these
Yeah.
plants,
Keep bearing
and
fruit and all that. Yeah. Mhm.
they did that, but they didn't have rules for anything else. So they start killing each other. They start acting horribly towards each other. And God's like, well, I need to sort of contain that. And so it appears that because like within 3 verses of God saying, sort of coming to that realization of, these beings who I created to be like reflections of me, they're not me. They are flesh and blood, and they are imperfect. They're going to err. They're going to, that consciousness that I gave them is, the free will that they're going to
Mhm.
abuse that. And so, that's just a reality of human nature. So we need to have some rules. So God says, okay, so you can't murder other people. You can't steal. You need to have courts of justice. And you can't pull the limbs off of living creatures, meaning the non-humans. And God says at that point, I give to you the animals to eat.
Mm.
It appears that the idea there was you have a bloodlust, you have a proclivity towards violence. I want you to not take it out on each other. I want you to channel it in this other
Hmm.
direction. It will be still morally suspect, but at least you won't be murdering each other. So, like, that's, a theory of moral regulation, sort of like a Hobbesian view,
Right.
that like we need to have certain rules, and we need to recognize that human beings are pretty awful. And the theory is, well, we need to focus on being good to each other before we like extend our compassion towards others. This is where, so I'm, just going to fast forward to now. We Jewish vegans, we rabbis and others who are looking at the reality of our world, we can say, well, where have we come when it comes to our treatment of each other? Isn't it possible? And the answer is yes.
Mhm.
That um,
Spoiler alert.
right.
Mhm.
That if we expand our circle of compassion and have a consideration for the most vulnerable and do, the baseline easiest thing of just living vegan, and not causing harm and not promoting all of that exploitation, um, isn't that likely to sort of filter up into how we comport ourselves with others? Now, there are a lot of nasty vegans. in terms of how they treat each other. So we can debunk on one hand, like being vegan is not an automatic ticket to being good to others, although there have been studies like various like moral psychological.
Right. And like I like to say, that veganism is the moral baseline. So that doesn't mean that everyone that's just like you don't have that strike against you. Like to
Right,
me, you're not the bottom. You've met the baseline. You're not subpar. But
right.
back to kosher. So the idea that kosher that can you say kosherism? I don't know that kosher
Well, yeah,
is
the Hebrew that makes it a noun is kashrut.
kashrut. Okay.
Yeah,
So
the
these
idea of purity.
kashrut, can we say that that was a tool to ameliorate our kind of our impact on animals? Because it seems like a lot of the kosher rules that I'm aware of, again, as an outsider, as a person who's not part of the faith, I I see them as ways to kind of mitigate harm
Right.
to those animals. So would that be a result of the flood? Like, okay, they aren't equals at the moral in our moral community. Like they're established. Like the Torah establishes that they are not the animals are not equal in the moral community, but if we are going to carry out these atrocities against them, we need to have a couple rules to not make it quite so horrible. Is that the
Right. So at the flood, for all of humanity, the rules are uh, not to commit like the most egregious abuse of tearing off the limbs of living animals, and that you cannot consume the blood.
blood,
There's
right? The drinking of the blood was yes,
like creating some distance and recognizing, and it
Mhm.
says because blood is the life force.
Right.
So there needs to be a consciousness that and we'll hear people talk about that today about I kill my animals with respect and a
Right.
consciousness, and I think it at a in a pre modern time when it was a lot harder for societies to say we're going to be able to be fully healthy without animal protein. That
Well,
consciousness,
I mean, yes, and I think that there's also if we take the flood to be a truly the Great Deluge, if we actually take that as a literary, you know, if we take it literal that that's actually what occurred, that the world was flooded, there would be no vegetation. I mean, there would be nothing to eat, and it
oh,
almost
that's a
seems
really interesting point.
it
Wow.
almost
Yeah.
seems to me it's always seemed like this is something where the writers painted themselves in a corner
Uh-huh.
and and had to figure out how to get even early writing. Like, I mean, this is pre-modern writing, and
Yeah.
even they have to figure out how they're going to get Noah out of trouble in the
Yeah.
end.
Right. Right. Like he plants a vineyard, but
Right.
meantime, what's he going to eat? Right. So
Right. He's only
that's a
got the
great.
animals.
Right, right, right. So, so there, that's like a really low baseline of don't pull the limbs off of living animals and don't.
Mm,
Vegan yoga mama pops up. Kosher slaughter made me go vegan overnight. Just watching it. Okay, I'll get to that, Lauren.
mm,
Then we fast forward to the covenant between God and the people of Israel, Jewish people, and then we get a even more tightening and narrowing of now you can't eat all the animals. Only
mhm,
certain animals are allowed. So clearly, one way of looking at that is all right. Well, then there's going to be maybe less slaughter.
mhm.
And of course, we're not talking factory farms at this point, right?
Right. We're
So,
talking early farming methods. We're talking,
right.
yeah, the storage of.
People have
Mhm,
3 cows at a time in their
right.
own yard, kind of thing.
Yeah.
Right, one, yeah. So lots of species are now not to be killed, and then the other two major pieces are one is another kind of consciousness awareness piece of not eating. Do not boil a kid in their mother's milk, which then comes to be understood of not to
Suckling
eat
milk and
meat and dairy at the same time. And a lot of the classical commentaries about all of the kosher laws are just like, well, this is just where we're supposed to follow what's given to us. And yes, we can look at how this creates an identity of our people and that just gives more
Well, we can,
consciousness in our lives. But I would push it, as many do, and say it's not just more consciousness to living, like eating mindfully in general, but eating mindfully in terms of thinking about where did my food come from, who were these beings before before they were slaughtered or milked, and that and those products wound up on my plate. There's that awareness. A mother and her baby is what it's telling us. And so, again, fast forward to today and all of the, rape and awful abuse of the dairy
right.
industry and the whole animal agriculture, that like we can't look away,
We can't look away,
and it's
but
telling us like way back then, like that we need to see it and we need to be aware of it.
that's
So
what I feel as well. Like you feel like it's a mindfulness exercise, and if anyone's done any mindful eating or any of the studying any Eastern religion, they talk a lot about. They touch on exactly what you're saying. It's a way
yeah,
of connecting yourself. But it seems to be that, especially with Judeo-Christian traditions, we tend to get bogged down in these rules and dogma rather than understand the spirit
yeah,
of where they come from. And it would seem, and I don't think I'm completely off base, that when you take the spirit of the law, of kosher laws, or most of the laws that we have in the Bible, if we take the spirit of them and we take them to their logical conclusions, we get to something looking a lot like veganism.
yeah. It was like so that's the thinking, is that they didn't. So first of all, is that they're animal sacrifices. The whole ritual
Mm,
system involves the slaughtering of animals. Now, one thing to know is in Leviticus,
my favorite.
uh,
This is my favorite
it's
one.
a complicated book, but
The most cherry picked book in all of Scripture.
right, right,
Yeah.
right. So here's what a lot of people don't talk about. So there's a whole ritual system. It says, um, anyone who kills an animal outside the of the sacrificial realm, has spilled blood, is culpable for being, it doesn't equate it with the murder of a human being, but like has blood on their hands. And
Yes, it ain't good. Yeah.
the only, according to Leviticus, the only slaughter is for ritual purposes. Now, obviously, we find that anathema,
Mm.
but that was the world they live in. And later commentators and philosophers explain, like, well, these people had just come out of slavery in Egypt. They
Mm.
were living in an idolatrous world, that there was a progression in terms of their religious and spiritual life as well. And so that it was a big deal that they weren't doing human sacrifice. That was like
Right.
pro-
That was the yeah. That's how progressive the religion was.
right.
Right. Yeah. That's
Eventually, we stopped with the animal sacrifice because the Romans destroyed the temple and basically did an ethnic cleansing of the Jewish people from most of them from the land of Judea. Only a small remnant remained. um
and also the
so
popularity of Christianity rose, and we like
Oh
the
yeah, I mean that whole first, second century
yeah.
Judea, so much transformation of the
Mm.
world. So that was the end of animal sacrifice, but later commentators are pretty much like, well, yeah, and then we developed prayer and synagogue life, and like that's better,
Yes,
that's more
atonement.
refined.
Yeah, we have all, yeah, right. We developed personal
So
sacrifice rather than
right,
is.
right. The Leviticus view was like basically saying if you didn't have the temple, then you would be vegan, because we're uh, we're not allowing any other slaughter. In Deuteronomy, it says if you live far away from the temple and you have a lustful urge to consume meat, then you may take from your herd or flock. So it's giving a permission, but it's doing it with this jab,
Mm-hmm.
saying, like, because you have not achieved the moral refinement that ideally, like, you wouldn't have that lustful urge. And if you do, okay, so it's like, we're gonna make a concession. That's a better word than compromise, is a concession.
Right.
It's from your own flock. So
You've got to
there's the
raise the
idea,
animal. You've got to,
right,
right.
you need to have like a relationship with it. Because remember, sacrifice, people forget, I think, that the word sacrifice is you're giving something up.
Right.
It's like, this is, I mean, it was property, but that there
It's
was
a
a
loss. It's a
negotiation.
personal loss for
Loss.
some gain.
Right.
Right. That's
Right. And so,
it's a bargain at the end. It's bargaining with
right.
God. It's what.
So if you can't come to the temple in Jerusalem, and it's not going to be an official sacrifice, you're still going to have to give something up. And
Mm,
it needs to be like, there's no going to the corner store and buying a cellophane wrapped piece of,
yeah.
something that you have no
Right.
idea what
Right.
it
That
is.
doesn't count. Yeah.
Right.
That's not your flock.